The night Lisa died, a piece of Joseph Malone died with her. The news had hit him like a sledgehammer, cleaving his life cleanly into before and after. In the days that followed, he moved as if underwater, his world dulled and heavy, his senses muffled by the unbearable weight of loss. Friends and family came and went, offering hugs and well-meaning words that he could barely register. Their faces blurred together, and their voices were distant, as if calling to him from the end of a dark tunnel. Yet Joseph held on to a fragile hope that justice would prevail. He convinced himself that the system, flawed as it was, would not fail his daughter. For years, Joseph had trusted in rules and procedures, believing that society's pillars, though imperfect, stood on principles of justice. He believed that the police would find the person who had taken his daughter away and make them pay. And so, for a short time, he did nothing but wait, holding his grief in a clenched fist and repeating to himself that it was only a matter of time. It didn't take long for the cracks to appear. At first, there were delays in communication, vague responses from the detectives on the case, and whispers in the community about the killer remaining at large. Joseph tried to rationalize it all. They're being thorough, he told himself. Justice can't be rushed. But as days turned into weeks, that conviction faltered. Joseph attended meetings with support groups organized by local NGOs, groups for families of victims like him, all hoping for closure. He sat in on sessions where other parents and spouses spoke about years spent fighting for justice that never came. He listened, silent, as they recounted tales of police incompetence, neglected evidence, and authorities more interested in closing cases than solving them. Each story was another blow to his faith, chiseling away the hope he had clung to. He began to see the reality that everyone else seemed to have accepted. Lisa's case could easily be shelved, another unsolved mystery in a system that had let so many others down. A smoldering anger flared to life inside him. He felt it gnaw at him in the dead of night, leaving him restless and pacing through the house, replaying the details of that terrible day over and over in his mind. He imagined how Lisa had felt in her last moments, the terror that must have seized her. The thought that no one would pay for that horror was unthinkable. Emma, his wife, watched Joseph with a mixture of fear and sorrow. She had lost her daughter too, but the man standing before her now was also slipping away. One night, she found him in their daughter's room, surrounded by Lisa's belongings. Old birthday cards, her childhood teddy bear, faded pictures from their family vacations. He looked almost trance-like, his face pale, his eyes lost in a world of pain. "Joseph," she whispered as she stepped into the room, afraid of disturbing the quiet that hung heavy in the air. "You can't keep doing this to yourself. To us." He didn't look at her, didn't acknowledge her words. She took a deep breath, steeling herself before she continued. This obsession. I'm afraid of what it's doing to you." She reached out, her hand hovering over his shoulder before finally resting there, hoping to draw him back, even if only for a moment. "Please, Joseph. You need to let go. We have to try to move forward, for both of us." He turned to face her, his eyes hard, empty of the gentleness she had once known. "Move forward." His voice was bitter, almost mocking. "Our daughter was murdered, Emma. Taken from us. How do you expect me to just accept that?" She recoiled, her hand slipping from his shoulder. "I just want you to find peace. For both our sakes, Joseph." "Peace?" he repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. "How can there be peace when Lisa's killer is still out there?" Emma knew that any word she offered would only deepen the chasm between them, so she left him there, standing in Lisa's room, surrounded by the memories of a life that would never be complete. After that night, Joseph felt a cold certainty settle over him. He understood that the system would not deliver justice. He had heard too many stories of unanswered calls, ignored evidence, of families like his own who waited years, only to be told to move on. Joseph could no longer bear to sit back, passively waiting, hoping for something that might never come. Without another word to Emma, he began his own investigation. He spent hours poring over every detail the police had given him, what little there was. He visited the scene of Lisa's murder, combing through every square inch, his eyes sharp, searching for anything that the police might have missed. He started talking to people who lived near the area, hoping someone had seen something, heard something that the police had overlooked. But he found nothing, each dead end stoking the flames of his anger. Then, one day, he was approached by a detective, his expression one of irritation rather than empathy. "Mr. Malone," the detective said, his tone harsh, "we understand you're grieving, but interfering with a police investigation is a serious offense. This has to stop." Joseph's fists clenched at his sides. He felt his jaw tighten, his restraint fraying with each word from the detective's mouth. "Interfering," he spat. "If you were doing your job, I wouldn't have to." The detective's face twisted with barely concealed annoyance. "Watch yourself, Mr. Malone. We're doing everything we can. But these things, they take time. It's best if you leave it to the professionals." He turned and walked away, leaving Joseph standing alone, his rage boiling over. He felt his heart pound in his chest, the weight of his grief twisting into something darker, something that demanded action. That confrontation was the breaking point. As Joseph walked away from that scene, he felt a final shift inside him. The man he had been, the rule follower, the law-abider, was gone. What remained was a father with nothing left to lose. His daughter was dead, his trust in the system shattered, and his marriage hanging by a thread. If he wanted justice, he would have to find it himself. He didn't care about the risks anymore. He had a promise to keep, a debt to settle. Joseph knew this path would change him, twist him into something unrecognizable, something ruthless. But for Lisa, he would sacrifice his very soul. The old Joseph was dead. In his place stood a man ready to do whatever it took to avenge his daughter's death. Joseph knew he couldn't take on the violent underbelly of the city alone. He needed someone who understood the language of the streets, someone who knew how to navigate danger and was not afraid of getting their hands dirty. There was only one person he could think of, Mike Turner, his old friend from his days in the Swat. Mike had always been a wild card, the kind of man who leaned more on instincts than rules, a habit that had ultimately led him to leave the force under a cloud of controversy. As Joseph approached Mike's secluded, dimly lit bar in the outskirts of the city, he felt a strange mix of nostalgia and caution. They hadn't seen each other in years, not since Joseph had distanced himself from the force after Lisa's birth, trading late-night patrols for bedtime stories. He wondered if Mike still had the same sharp gaze, the barely contained energy that could turn deadly in an instant. Pushing open the door, Joseph found Mike behind the bar, pouring a drink for a lone patron who looked like he'd seen better days. Mike was older now, the lines on his face deeper, his hair starting to thin. But the intense gleam in his eyes was unmistakable. As Joseph stepped closer, Mike looked up, and a grin spread across his face. "Joseph Malone," he said, chuckling. "I must be dreaming. What brings you down to my neck of the woods?" Joseph wasted no time, his voice low and unsteady. "I need your help, Mike. Lisa's dead. Murdered. And the police? They're doing nothing." Mike's smile faded instantly, replaced by a hard look that Joseph remembered all too well. "Hell, Joe," he muttered, coming around the bar. "I'm sorry. Lisa was a good kid. You know I'd do anything to help." They talked for hours, discussing leads, information, and the kind of people who might be involved. Mike listened intently, nodding as Joseph laid out his own rough investigation and theories. As they talked, Joseph could feel a flicker of hope rekindling. With Mike by his side, he wouldn't be so helpless. But from the start, a tension simmered beneath their alliance. For Joseph, this was about vengeance, about getting justice for Lisa. But for Mike, the game was different. Joseph began to see glimpses of Mike's true motivations as they moved deeper into the underworld, probing for information, making connections, and tracking down anyone who might be involved. Mike's ambitions were not limited to helping a grieving father. He saw a chance to gain influence among the powerful criminal networks that ran the city, to cement himself as a player in their world. One evening, they arranged a meeting with a small-time gang connected to a notorious figure in the criminal world. They arrived at an abandoned warehouse by the docks, where a handful of men in leather jackets waited, eyeing them with distrust. The leader, a wiry man with a scar across his cheek, leaned against a stack of crates, smirking as Mike introduced himself and Joseph. "So, you two are looking for information," the man said, his tone dripping with disdain. "What makes you think we'd help you?" Before Joseph could speak, Mike took a step forward, his voice dangerously calm. "Because it's in your best interest to help us. You give us what we need, and maybe we look the other way on some of your business ventures." Joseph stiffened, his fists clenching at his sides. He hadn't come here to barter his principles for favors. He wanted answers, not alliances with criminals. "What are you doing, Mike?" Joseph hissed, his voice low but furious. "This isn't what we agreed on." Mike shot him a look, a dangerous glint in his eyes. "Relax, Joe. We have to play the game. These guys don't give a damn about your vendetta. They want to know what's in it for them. I'm just giving them a reason to cooperate." But Joseph couldn't hide his disgust. Turning to the gang leader, he stepped closer, his voice sharp and uncompromising. "I don't care about your business ventures. My daughter was murdered, and if you have any information that might help me find her killer, you'll tell me now." The gang leader's smirk faltered under Joseph's piercing glare, and after a tense pause, he muttered something about rumors, a whisper of an unknown enforcer who'd recently taken on more work than usual. But the encounter left a sour taste in Joseph's mouth. As they walked away from the warehouse, the tension between him and Mike was palpable. "You can't make deals with people like that, Mike," Joseph snapped. "I'm not here to become part of this world. I just want justice for Lisa." Mike laughed bitterly, shaking his head. "You really think you can do this with your hands clean, Joe? You want to go after these guys, you play by their rules, or you end up dead." Joseph knew Mike was right, but it didn't make the reality any easier to swallow. Despite their clashing perspectives, they pressed on, and their investigations led them further into the dark maze of the city's criminal networks. But the growing divide between them became harder to ignore, each argument cutting deeper, each disagreement chipping away at their fragile alliance. The final break came one night in a dingy alleyway, where they had been led by a supposed informant. As they moved in, shadows shifted around them, and suddenly Joseph realized they were surrounded. An ambush! Before he could react, Mike's hand was on his shoulder, pulling him back. "Take cover!" Mike yelled, but as Joseph stumbled to the ground, he saw Mike turning and retreating, disappearing into the darkness. Shock and fury surged through him as he realized that Mike was abandoning him. The sound of footsteps grew closer, and Joseph, his mind racing, pressed himself against the grimy wall, barely able to catch his breath. He could hear the muffled voices of the attackers, laughing, closing in. Desperation took over, and he fought with a ferocity he didn't know he possessed, using every tactic he had learned in his years on the force. His fists met flesh, his movements honed by the rage and betrayal churning inside him. He fought his way through the ambush, leaving his attackers sprawled and groaning in the alley, a string of bruises and cuts covering his body. By the time he staggered out of the alley and back onto the street, he was exhausted, but alive. He had barely escaped with his life, and all thanks to Mike's betrayal. Joseph couldn't shake the feeling that he had been set up, that Mike had planned this. The realization hit him like a cold wave. The man he had trusted was gone, replaced by someone who would rather use him as a pawn than stand by his side. That night, Joseph sat alone in a small motel room, nursing his wounds, his mind a storm of anger and regret. He had trusted Mike, had believed that his friend would help him bring justice for Lisa. But now he was truly alone. Mike's betrayal severed the last thread of trust Joseph had in others. If he wanted justice, he would have to do it without alliances, without the false hope of friends who would only lead him into darkness. The betrayal hardened something in Joseph. His mission, once fueled by grief, was now a relentless thirst for vengeance. He would hunt down the killers, one by one if he had to, and he would do it on his own terms. He was finished with alliances. This was a war, and he was prepared to face it alone. After the betrayal and near-death experience, Joseph's anger transformed into something darker, sharper. He no longer trusted anyone. His mission had become a solitary pursuit, fueled by a fire that seemed to burn hotter with each passing day. The thought of Mike's betrayal gnawed at him, but even worse was the absence of closure for Lisa. His heart still throbbed with pain, but he forced himself to press on. He was alone in his hunt, and that was exactly how he wanted it. Days blurred together as Joseph continued to dig through the city's darkest corners. His relentless drive earned him whispers of respect and fear from those on the streets. People in the criminal underworld knew better than to cross him now. He began noticing subtle signs that he wasn't alone, though, that he was being watched, manipulated. It was in the way certain people avoided his questions or hesitated before responding. Something about it all felt off. But every time he tried to investigate further, the trail seemed to vanish into the shadows, leaving him more frustrated and suspicious. Then, one evening, he returned to his dingy apartment to find a note slipped under the door. It was a simple piece of paper, creased and worn, with words scrawled in a hurried hand. "Your daughter is closer than you think." Joseph's heart lurched. His first instinct was to dismiss it as a cruel joke, but something about the note felt eerily genuine. He examined the paper, his fingers tracing over each letter as if it might hold a clue. The handwriting was unfamiliar, but the message was unmistakable. He paced the room, his mind racing through every possible interpretation. Had he missed something? Had the police made a mistake, or worse, lied to him? Despite his doubts, he couldn't ignore the slim thread of hope that began to weave itself into his thoughts. Driven by a renewed urgency, Joseph set out to revisit the scene of Lisa's murder, convinced he had overlooked something vital. He arrived at the abandoned stretch of street, now bathed in the pale glow of streetlights. The memories flooded back, the yellow crime scene tape, the chalk outline marking the spot where Lisa's body had been found. Joseph's jaw clenched as he forced himself to relive it all. This was the last place his daughter had been alive, and he was determined to scour every inch of it until he found something. As he walked through the area, he noticed a small store across the street. It had security cameras fixed to the front, their lenses trained on the road where Lisa had been attacked. His pulse quickened as he approached the shop, a quiet, nondescript place with dusty windows and a dim interior. The store owner, an elderly man with a guarded expression, looked up as Joseph entered. "Can I help you?" the man asked, his voice cautious. Joseph leaned on the counter, his gaze intense. "Those cameras out front, do they record?" he asked. The man hesitated, his eyes flickering with something Joseph couldn't quite place. "They do," he admitted. "But that footage, it's long gone. The police took the tapes after the incident. I haven't heard from them since." Joseph's heart sank, but he couldn't give up. "Do you keep any backup copies?" he asked, grasping at straws. The man shook his head, avoiding Joseph's gaze. "No. Once they took the footage, I had nothing left. I didn't want any trouble." The man trailed off, his face clouded with something that looked like regret or fear. Frustrated, Joseph left the shop, his mind swirling with questions. As he walked away, another thought began to nag at him. The man had been evasive, hesitant to answer his questions. Had he been lying? Or worse, was he afraid of someone watching him? Joseph's paranoia deepened. In the following days, more notes arrived, each more cryptic than the last. One was left on the windshield of his car. "Not everything you believe is true." Another was slipped through his mailbox with a single word scrawled in red ink: "Awake." The messages began to drive Joseph to the edge of sanity, each one gnawing at his resolve, making him question everything he thought he knew. His sleepless nights grew longer, his nightmares darker. He became haunted by the thought that he might have buried an empty casket, that Lisa might still be alive somewhere, out there, waiting for him. And then, one night, he received a package. Wrapped in brown paper, it was small, light, yet felt heavy in his hands as he carried it to the kitchen table. His hands trembled as he opened it, peeling away the layers of wrapping to reveal a delicate silver bracelet, Lisa's bracelet. He remembered the day he'd bought it for her, her face lighting up with that radiant smile that had made his heart soar. The sight of it now filled him with equal parts hope and dread. If Lisa were truly alive, why was she being kept from him? Who had taken her, and why? A second thought sent a shiver through him. If Lisa wasn't alive, who was tormenting him with these cruel reminders? Joseph's mind raced as he examined the bracelet. There was a small note tucked beneath it. "She is closer than you think." This time, the note included an address on the outskirts of town, a run-down neighborhood where vacant buildings stood like skeletons, their windows dark and broken. Joseph knew it was likely a trap, a setup meant to toy with his emotions and perhaps even end his life. But he couldn't ignore it. If there was even a chance, a tiny glimmer of hope that Lisa might be alive, he had to follow it. That night, he drove to the address, his grip tight on the steering wheel, his mind a storm of anticipation and dread. The streets were deserted as he parked his car a block away, moving silently through the shadows, his eyes scanning every window, every darkened doorway for movement. He arrived at the building, an old, abandoned apartment complex, its walls scarred with graffiti and layers of grime. The windows were dark, the air thick with silence. Joseph's heart pounded as he climbed the steps, his breath shallow, his mind racing with fear and hope in equal measure. Inside, the air was cold, filled with the smell of mildew and dust. The hallways stretched ahead of him, dark and empty. He moved slowly, carefully, every nerve on edge. Finally, he reached the door listed on the note, his hand trembling as he reached for the handle. The door creaked open, revealing an empty, dimly lit room. On a table in the center lay a single photograph. As Joseph picked it up, his heart froze. It was a picture of Lisa, but taken after her supposed death. She looked tired, pale, her eyes filled with a strange sadness, but it was unmistakably her. Joseph's vision blurred as he clutched the photo to his chest, a mix of rage and relief coursing through him. Whoever had taken her, whoever was holding her captive, had orchestrated this entire nightmare. He now had proof, a tangible piece of evidence that Lisa was out there, alive. The tormentor had made one mistake. They had underestimated Joseph's resolve. As he walked out of the building, a fierce determination burned within him. He would find her. He would bring his daughter back, no matter the cost. And for the first time, he felt that he was no longer alone in his quest. Someone else knew the truth, and they were leading him closer to it with every cruel message, every haunting clue. Joseph's journey had led him to the doorstep of a man whose name sent chills through the city's underworld. William Devereaux, known to the criminal world as the Punisher. William was notorious not only for his ruthlessness but also for his mastery of secrets, holding power over people with information rather than brute force. Whispers had circulated for months that Devereaux was tied to Lisa's disappearance, orchestrating events from the shadows to keep her hidden, and to keep Joseph desperate and enraged. The clues had all pointed to this mansion, an old Victorian estate hidden in a remote area at the edge of the city. Surrounded by acres of overgrown forest and shielded from prying eyes, the mansion was known as the last stop for those who dared cross Devereaux. Joseph arrived under the cover of night, his heart pounding with anticipation, his mind torn between dread and hope. He didn't know what he would find here, but every instinct told him Lisa was near. The mansion loomed like a phantom in the darkness, its high windows dark, its stone walls cloaked in shadow. As Joseph slipped through the dense trees surrounding the property, he spotted armed guards patrolling the grounds. He observed their movements, noting the patterns, the brief moments when they turned their backs, and the blind spots they left exposed. He moved with quiet determination, each step careful, each breath steady. His training kicked in, the instincts honed by years on the SWAT team guiding him through the shadows. At the edge of the property, Joseph found an opening in the outer wall, a crumbling section where the brick had been weakened over time. He slipped through, crouching low as he approached the mansion. Just as he reached the side entrance, a guard rounded the corner, his flashlight slicing through the darkness. Joseph held his breath, pressing himself against the wall as the guard's footsteps grew closer. With swift, silent precision, Joseph sprang forward, grabbing the guard from behind and subduing him before he could call for help. The guard slumped to the ground, and Joseph dragged him into the shadows, his hands trembling but his mind focused. Once inside, Joseph found himself in a grand hall, the walls lined with portraits of men and women with cold, unfeeling eyes. The place was eerily quiet, save for the faint hum of electricity somewhere deep within the mansion's maze-like corridors. His pulse raced as he moved deeper into the building, checking rooms and hallways, his every sense heightened. The mansion's interior was a blend of luxury and decay, with richly decorated rooms marred by dust and neglect. It was as if the place had been abandoned long ago, but beneath the surface lay a current of sinister energy, like a predator lurking in the dark. After what felt like an eternity of winding through dimly lit corridors, Joseph found a heavy, iron door at the end of a narrow passage. It was locked, but a small window set into the door allowed him to peer inside. What he saw made his breath catch. There, sitting on a thin mattress in the corner of the room, was Lisa. She looked fragile, her face pale, her eyes hollowed by exhaustion, but she was unmistakably alive. Joseph's hands shook as he gripped the door, his heart hammering with a mixture of relief and rage. He had found her. His daughter, who he had grieved, who he had believed gone forever, was right there, only a few feet away. But before he could act, a voice echoed through the corridor. "I see you found her." Joseph turned slowly, his jaw clenched, his body coiled to strike. William Devereux stood a few feet away, a smirk tugging at the corner of his lips. He was tall, imposing, with piercing blue eyes that seemed to see straight through Joseph. Dressed in a dark, impeccably tailored suit, Devereux exuded a cold confidence, his hands casually tucked into his pockets. "Devereux," Joseph spat, his voice filled with venom. "Why did you take her?" Devereux's smile widened, a glint of amusement in his eyes. "Because, Mr. Malone, some men need a reminder of what they stand to lose. You see, people like you believe in justice, in fair play. It's admirable, and so very naive." He paused, glancing over his shoulder at the door behind him, where Lisa remained locked away. "I gave you a purpose, Joseph. I gave you something to fight for." Joseph took a step closer, his fists clenched. "You took everything from me. For what? For your twisted game." Devereux's expression darkened, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. "I took nothing that wasn't already broken. Your family was fragile, your life predictable. You needed this, even if you can't see it." He gestured towards the door, his eyes gleaming with twisted satisfaction. "But she's alive, isn't she? Because I chose for her to be." Unable to contain his rage, Joseph lunged at Devereux, his fists swinging with all the force of his anger and pain. They crashed to the floor, grappling, each man straining to gain the upper hand. Devereux was stronger than Joseph had anticipated, his movements quick and calculated, but Joseph's fury fueled him, driving him to fight with a savage intensity. They grappled, trading blows, blood trickling from Joseph's split lip and a dark bruise forming under Devereux's eye. Finally, with a surge of strength, Joseph pinned Devereux against the floor, his hand wrapped around the man's throat. "Give me the key," Joseph growled, his voice barely more than a rasp. "Now." Devereux laughed, even as his face reddened under Joseph's grip. "You think this ends with her freedom? Go ahead, take her. But understand, this story is only beginning. You'll never have peace, Joseph. Not as long as I live. With a final strangled laugh, Devereaux reached into his pocket and produced a small silver key, dropping it to the floor beside him. Joseph snatched it up, his gaze never leaving Devereaux's twisted smile. He fought the urge to end the man's life right there, to silence him forever, but he knew that every second counted. Lisa needed him. He released Devereaux, pushing himself to his feet, and turned to the door, sliding the key into the lock. The door creaked open, and Joseph stepped inside, his heart pounding as he approached Lisa. She looked up, her eyes widening with disbelief. "Dad," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Joseph dropped to his knees beside her, pulling her into his arms, the weight of his relief nearly overwhelming him. "It's me, Lisa. I'm here. I'm so sorry. I never gave up. I never stopped looking." They stayed there, clinging to each other in the dim light, the silence broken only by the sound of their ragged breaths. But even in this moment of reunion, Joseph knew they weren't safe yet. Devereaux's influence extended far beyond the walls of this mansion, and he would stop at nothing to reclaim what he considered his. Joseph pulled back, his hands on Lisa's shoulders as he looked her in the eyes. "We have to get out of here. Can you walk?" Lisa nodded, though her legs trembled as she rose. Together, they made their way out of the room, moving quickly and quietly, every step filled with the urgency of escape. As they reached the outer hallway, Joseph threw one last look back at Devereaux, who lay on the floor, his laughter echoing down the empty corridors. Joseph knew this wasn't over. Devereaux's promise lingered in his mind, a dark shadow over their future. But for now, he had Lisa, and that was all that mattered. Holding her close, he led her through the mansion, determined to protect her from the man who had stolen so much from them. With Lisa finally by his side, Joseph felt a surge of fierce determination. The world around them seemed frozen as they crept through the shadowed hallways of Devereaux's mansion, each step measured and silent. The mansion's walls, once confining, now felt like a gauntlet they had to conquer to regain their freedom. Outside these walls, escape awaited. Inside, Devereaux's men were regrouping, prepared to stop them at any cost. They reached a winding staircase, and Joseph paused, listening intently. Lisa was trembling beside him, her thin frame a stark reminder of what she had endured in her captivity. He gave her a reassuring squeeze. "Stay close to me, and don't make a sound," he whispered, his voice low but calm. Just as they descended the stairs, the sharp click of footsteps echoed from down the hall. Joseph's mind raced. Turning back wasn't an option. They needed to get outside and put as much distance as possible between themselves and this place. He motioned for Lisa to hide behind a nearby pillar, crouching low with her as the footsteps grew louder. Through the dim light, they saw the figures of two guards approaching, their eyes scanning the area. Joseph felt the tension in Lisa's grip on his arm, her fingers digging into his skin as the guards passed dangerously close. He waited, his breathing shallow, until the guards were out of sight, then motioned to Lisa that it was time to move. As they reached the main floor, a slight breeze filtered in from a hallway to their left, a sign that an exit lay somewhere nearby. They navigated their way toward the source of the breeze, but just as they rounded the corner, a booming voice echoed from behind them. "There they are. Don't let them escape." Joseph's heart leaped. Grabbing Lisa's hand, he pulled her forward, sprinting down the hall as a cacophony of voices erupted behind them. Adrenaline flooded his veins as he pushed forward, the thought of losing Lisa again lending him strength. The echoes of footsteps filled the hallway, coming closer with every second. Finally, they burst into a wide, open foyer where a grand set of double doors stood at the other end. Freedom was so close, almost within reach. But as they raced toward the doors, the sound of gunfire erupted behind them, bullets tearing into the walls and shattering glass. Joseph threw himself in front of Lisa, shielding her as he guided her toward the doors. "Run, Lisa!" he shouted, shoving her forward as he spun around to face their pursuers. A group of armed guards was barreling down the hall, weapons raised, their faces set with grim determination. Joseph's mind whirred as he assessed his options. He spotted a large ornamental vase on a pedestal and with a powerful kick, sent it crashing into the path of their attackers. It shattered, sending shards skidding across the marble floor, forcing the guards to pause just long enough for him and Lisa to burst through the double doors. They found themselves in a courtyard bathed in pale moonlight, the cool night air a stark contrast to the suffocating heat of the mansion. Trees and thick shrubbery bordered the courtyard, and beyond them lay the forest that surrounded Devereaux's estate. If they could make it to the tree line, they might have a chance to evade the guards. "Come on, Lisa. We're almost out," Joseph urged, pulling her toward the trees. They sprinted across the courtyard, their footsteps echoing against the stone. But just as they neared the edge, the roar of an engine shattered the night silence. A pair of headlights flared to life, illuminating their path and blinding them for a split second. A black SUV screeched to a stop, blocking their way. More guards poured out, their guns trained on Joseph and Lisa. Joseph placed himself protectively in front of her, his mind racing, searching for a way out. The leader of the group stepped forward, a tall, muscular man with a scar across his cheek, his face twisted into a smirk. "You really thought you could escape Devereaux that easily?" he sneered. "You're in his world now, Malone. No one leaves without his permission." But Joseph was past the point of fear. He clenched his fists, his gaze hardening. "I'll die before I let any of you lay another finger on her." A flicker of amusement crossed the man's face. "That can be arranged." He gestured to his men. "Take them." As the guards advanced, Joseph's body coiled, his instincts taking over. He lunged forward, catching the first guard off guard, disarming him with swift precision. He turned the weapon on the others, firing a series of shots that scattered the men, forcing them to take cover. The courtyard exploded into chaos as gunfire echoed off the walls, bullets whizzing past, kicking up clouds of dust and shards of stone. In the confusion, Joseph grabbed Lisa's hand again, pulling her into the trees. The dense foliage provided some cover, but the guards' flashlights cut through the darkness, beams of light sweeping across the trees as they pursued them. Joseph led Lisa deeper into the woods, weaving through the shadows, his mind racing with each step. "Dad, I can't keep going," Lisa gasped, her voice shaking with exhaustion. Joseph stopped, turning to her. He placed a hand on her cheek, his gaze fierce but filled with a father's determination. "You're strong, Lisa. Stronger than you know. We're going to make it out of here. Together." With renewed resolve, they pressed on, moving deeper into the forest as the sounds of pursuit grew fainter. They navigated through tangled roots and low branches, the darkness swallowing them as they pushed forward. Just when Joseph thought they might have lost their pursuers, the forest fell silent. Too silent. A figure emerged from the shadows, a silhouette Joseph recognized instantly. William Devereaux stood there, blocking their path, his face a mask of cool confidence. He was flanked by two guards, their weapons trained on Joseph and Lisa. "Joseph," Devereaux said, his voice smooth, almost mocking. "You're a stubborn man. I admire that. But you're only prolonging the inevitable." Joseph stepped forward, his face inches from Devereaux's. "You took my daughter. You put her through hell, and you think I'll ever let you walk away from this?" Devereaux chuckled, an unsettling sound that echoed through the trees. "Lisa was never yours, Joseph. Not really. She belongs to me now. I've given her purpose, something you could never understand." In a blinding moment of rage, Joseph lunged at Devereaux. The two men collided, grappling fiercely as Lisa watched, her heart pounding. Joseph fought with everything he had, channeling months of grief, rage, and desperation into each punch. But Devereaux was ruthless, every movement calculated, and he soon overpowered Joseph, pinning him to the ground. As Devereaux leaned over him, a knife glinting in his hand, Joseph's eyes met Lisa's. "Run, Lisa," he choked out, his voice strained. Lisa hesitated, her face twisted with fear, but then she turned and fled into the trees. Devereaux's grip tightened, his smirk widening. "It's over, Joseph." But Joseph, with a final surge of strength, threw Devereaux off balance, rolling away and scrambling to his feet. His body screamed with exhaustion, but his resolve was unbreakable. He wouldn't stop. Not until Lisa was free. As Devereaux and his guards gave chase, Joseph vanished into the shadows, his every thought focused on one thing: getting his daughter to safety. The fight was far from over, but as long as he had breath, he would fight for her freedom. In the thick darkness of the forest, Joseph's breaths came in ragged gasps as he darted through the trees, his body battered and bruised but his spirit unbroken. He could hear Devereaux's men crashing through the underbrush behind him, their flashlights sweeping erratically as they searched for him. He had sent Lisa ahead, urging her to run and not look back. She was out there now, somewhere in the dark, running for her life. He had no way of knowing if she was safe, but he had to trust that she'd gotten far enough. A slight movement caught his eye, a dark figure approaching from his right. Instinct took over, and he lunged forward, tackling the man to the ground, silencing him before he could call out. But there was no time to celebrate his small victory. Devereaux's voice rang out through the trees, cold and taunting. "Joseph, you can't run forever. You're just prolonging the inevitable." The words sent a chill down Joseph's spine, but he forced himself to keep moving. He had no illusions about his chances against Devereaux and his men. They had the advantage in numbers and firepower. But Joseph knew the forest. He knew its shadows, its trails, and he clung to that small edge. He circled back, hoping to draw the men away from Lisa's path. His only goal now was to give her time to escape, to survive. But as he moved through the thick undergrowth, he stumbled upon something that made his heart skip a beat. Lisa's bracelet, glinting faintly in the moonlight, caught on a low branch. A surge of panic washed over him. Had she dropped it? Had she been captured? He gripped the bracelet in his hand, fighting the urge to scream. This was his fault. He had brought her back into this nightmare, and now she was in danger all over again. In the distance, he saw a small clearing with the faintest outline of Lisa's form, huddled behind a fallen tree. Relief flooded him as he made his way over, keeping low and quiet. "Lisa," he whispered, kneeling beside her. "Are you hurt?" She shook her head, tears streaming down her face, her body trembling. I thought you wouldn't come back," she whispered, clutching his arm as if he might disappear. Joseph pulled her close, his voice a strained whisper. "I'll always come back for you. Always." He held her tightly, feeling the weight of everything he had sacrificed to bring her to safety. But as he looked into her eyes, he knew their ordeal was far from over. Suddenly, a bright light swept over them, and Devereaux's voice rang out again, closer this time. Well, a family reunion. How touching." Joseph leapt to his feet, pulling Lisa behind him as Devereaux stepped into the clearing, flanked by two men armed with rifles. Devereaux's face was shadowed, but Joseph could see the satisfaction in his eyes, a sickening glee at having cornered them both. "Your journey ends here, Joseph," Devereaux said, his voice low and venomous. "But I'll make you an offer. Surrender, and I'll let her go. You have my word." Joseph knew better than to trust Devereaux, but he was out of options. He glanced back at Lisa, her eyes wide with terror, and something inside him snapped. If his life was the price for her freedom, he was willing to pay it. He stood tall, his hands clenched into fists. "Fine. But let her go now." Devereaux smirked, nodding to his men, who stepped forward to restrain Joseph. As they grabbed his arms, he cast one last look at Lisa, a silent message passing between them. She nodded, her eyes shimmering with determination, and before anyone could react, she bolted into the trees. Devereaux snarled, his composure slipping for the first time. "Stop her!" But it was too late. She was gone, disappearing into the forest. Joseph felt a surge of pride mixed with sadness as he watched her escape. He had done it. He had given her a chance. Devereaux turned to him, his face contorted with rage. "You think you've won, Malone? You're nothing but a pathetic man chasing a dream of justice in a world where there is none." Joseph glared back, unflinching. "Maybe. But at least I know I've done everything I could to save her." "That's more than you'll ever understand." Devereaux's expression twisted into a cold smile. He nodded to his men, who raised their rifles, the barrels trained on Joseph's chest. Joseph stood firm, refusing to give Devereaux the satisfaction of seeing him beg or plead. "Goodbye, Joseph," Devereaux said, his voice a chilling whisper. The shots rang out, a cacophony that shattered the silence of the forest. Joseph felt the impact, his body jerking as the bullets tore through him. He stumbled, the ground rising to meet him as he fell. Pain coursed through him, but a strange calm settled over his mind. He had done it. Lisa was free. As darkness closed in, Joseph's last thoughts were of her, the memory of her smile, her laughter. He had lost everything, but he had given her a chance to live. And that, he realized, was all he had ever wanted. Hours later, Lisa emerged from the forest, her face streaked with tears, her body weary and battered, but her spirit unbroken. She stumbled upon a rural highway, where a kind driver stopped and took her to the nearest police station. She told them everything: Devereaux, the mansion, her father's sacrifice. But when a team went to investigate, the mansion was abandoned, wiped clean as if no one had ever lived there. Over the following weeks, Lisa learned the depths of her father's sacrifice. His notes, hidden in his apartment, contained the truth about her captivity and the corruption that Devereaux wielded over the city. Determined to honor Joseph's memory, Lisa took her story public, gathering the courage to speak against Devereaux's empire. Her father's legacy became a rallying cry, sparking a wave of investigations that threatened to bring Devereaux's entire operation down. One morning, as she prepared for another interview, she found a note slipped under her door. Her heart raced as she opened it, expecting more threats. Instead, it read simply, "Your father would be proud. Keep fighting." A chill ran through her as she folded the note. Somewhere in the shadows, she felt her father's presence, his unyielding spirit living on through her actions. Joseph had given his life for her freedom, and now it was up to her to honor it. As she looked out over the city, Lisa felt her father's courage flowing through her. She had survived because of him, and she would carry his fight forward, bringing justice to those who had tried to break them.